Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's discussion on the first 100 days of the Biden administration and the 117th Congress. My name is Josh Feinstein. I'm a senior legislative analyst here at Venable. I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades working inside and outside of Congress, advocating policies on behalf of senators, members, and clients. Joining me today are 4 of my colleagues from Venable Government Affairs team. Our bipartisan team provides substantive, strategic counsel and impactful representation of your interests before the administration and Congress. Today, my colleagues and I will be focusing on the new Washington dynamic and how this could translate into law over the first few months of the year. What we know is that the incoming Biden administration is laser focused on COVID response. While they're also spending tremendous attention to immigration, climate change, and the world stage, the bulk of the legislative portfolio currently is on the pandemic. How a measure may come together, when, and the ways to get ahead of any measure is a primary focus of our discussion today. So without further ado, to provide additional strategic guidance and outlook, I would like to introduce my colleagues joining the conversation today. Congressman Art Stupak is a former member of Congress serving for 18 years. His experience with the Democrat caucus and service on the Energy and Commerce Committee provide expert analysis and insight for Venable clients as they navigate Congress and the incoming Biden administration. Sarah Donovan has been advising corporate and nonprofit clients on a wide range of legislative and regulatory matters for close to a decade. Over the last year, she has provided significant insight into the congressional COVID response, and specifically the Paycheck Protection Program and its impact on small businesses. Nick Choate is a former Senate and House staffer with over 15 years experience. He was a senior advisor to Senator Claire McCaskill and has extensive relationships with Senate and House Democratic staffers and the incoming Biden administration. Finally, Mike Bloomquist is the former staff director of the Energy and Commerce Committee under ranking member Greg Walden. Mike's understanding of committee and leadership dynamics provide valuable insight and advocacy for our clients. Now, without further ado, I'd like to start having some questions before the panelists. First, I'd like to talk about Georgia and its impact, because that's top of mind to a lot of our clients. As we know, the special election results was somewhat surprising to Republicans, but a lot of Democrats saw that outcome coming. All in all, that means that there's a split in the United States Senate of 50-50. Nick, with control of the United States Senate now with Democrats, what does this mean out of the gate?
Yeah, so I think out of the gate, the biggest change, 50-50 is still a narrow majority. Either way, we were going to have a narrow majority. But I think what Democrats holding the majority now does is it really changes who sets the agenda. The Biden administration is no longer going to be in a position where they have to negotiate everything with Mitch McConnell just to get a vote on the floor. With Schumer deciding what comes to the floor, with Democratic chairman deciding what committees consider and what gets a markup, that piece of it gets a little easier. I don't want to overstate how much easier it is, though. At the end of the day, short of budget reconciliation, which I think we're going to touch on later, you're still going to need 60 votes to do pretty much anything legislative in the Senate. So, you're still going to have to get those Republican votes at some point, but just that new dynamic of controlling the agenda is a huge game changer for Democrats on the Hill, but certainly the Biden administration as well.
Well, and Josh, let me jump in there a little bit on the House side now. Nick's right on the Senate side, but on the House side, when I went to Congress, I was in the majority and I was in minority, and I went back to the majority. And what it does, take H.R. 2, that was the big infrastructure bill that we all have some interest in, that was passed by the House. DeFazio's bill, it was passed by the House. Well, now they're going to have to take that H.R. 2, Moving Forward Act, and they had things in there knowing that Senate would never accept it. Now they're going to have to tweak it. They're going to have to tweak it because now it's a serious possibility it could get passed, and then you're going to have to go to conference. So the impact, not just the Senate, but that Senate, the two Senate seats they picked up, also impacts legislation on the House. And I think that some legislation will now become a little bit more moderate, if you will, knowing that you got such a slim majority in both House and Senate. So there's going to be some tweaking of legislation that has already passed the House. You would think they would just take that same piece of legislation, plug it in the 117th, but they're going to have to tweak it.
Yeah, and Nick and Congressman, you know, there were legislation that probably had 60 votes in the Senate, but could not make it to the floor based on the control of who controlled the floor, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, not an extensive list, but I mean, whether you're talking COVID response or infrastructure or some sort of immigration package, those are all things that theoretically have 60 plus votes in the Senate, no matter who's in the majority. But, you know, if you were dealing with Majority Leader McConnell, the question was, will you even get a vote? Now with Schumer, you still have to get to 60 votes, but pretty good chance you get a vote.
And dialing down into that a little bit, Sarah, how is that going to impact the nominations and what's been presented?
Well, it's exactly what Nick and the congressman have been saying, that Biden no longer needs to negotiate with McConnell on what, what comes up for a vote, and also who they'll put on the Senate calendar in terms of nominations. So it really opens it up a lot for President-elect Biden to nominate perhaps some people that he wouldn't have had the Senate control not switched over to have the Democrats a majority. So really, it's really a question of power and control of the Senate calendar and the Senate floor. And when that's with Schumer, it really opens things up a lot for Biden.
Yeah, and of course, when we're talking about nominations, whether it's to the administration or to the Supreme Court or other judicial branches, they have the bar has been lowered to 50 when the legislative filibuster the judicial filibuster was enacted. Turning gears to the legislative filibuster, a lot of conversation has taken place about whether or not that could be altered in some way if Democrats were to take the Senate. Mike, do we think filibuster reform is on the table? You're on mute, Mike.
Sorry about that. I think we have a little bit of mixed thinking in our group on that. I think we're all agreed that with the majority control being this tight, I think the preference for the Democratic leadership is to try to work using 60 votes, the traditional threshold to get cloture and avoid a filibuster, or to use reconciliation or other means that you don't need to get 60 votes and you can just get a simple majority to move ahead. I think where the rubber will meet the road is when there's some issue down the road that's very popular with the Democratic base and there's just one or two outliers and the cry starts going up to just, we could make this happen if we just get rid of the legislative filibuster. I think that's when the test will occur, but I think we're a ways off from that.
Well, I would agree with
Nick, really quickly. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Josh. I was just going to agree with Mike, but take the House side now. When they just passed their rules, and there is pay-go. In other words, everything you put on the floor, you have to pay for it. Democrats gave you two exceptions under pay-go: climate change and also COVID. So to me, if you get those two pieces of legislation and you're underneath a pay-go, which is the House filibuster, if you will, then Mike, it's going to be very easy to tack that into a reconciliation package or whatever, and you're going to pass it that way. So it was interesting how the House did their rules this time, which means they're serious about moving some legislation, being climate change and COVID, immediately, because I don't think there's going to be much of a honeymoon here at all.
Yeah. So really quickly, going back to just the filibuster reform, Nick, as a kind of a student of the Dem caucus in the Senate, working for Claire McCaskill and being around for a long time, we think that there are a few Democrat senators who would have much more heartburn with getting rid of any kind of legislative filibuster than not. What's the threshold in the Senate? What were the amount of seats they probably would have had to have gotten to really see something like this avalanche? I mean, being that something could still happen, but where's that kind of line?
For me, it was around 52 or 53 seats. If Democrats held 52 or 53 seats, you could lose, Senator Manchin and a Senator Sinema and still have potentially the votes to blow up or at least change the filibuster. At 50, it's just hard for me to see. I think Mike's point is a good one. Are Republicans so obstructionists? that it forces, revisiting of the conversation? Is there something so popular with the Democratic base that came out of the House, maybe even on a bipartisan basis, that they just can't get through the Senate? Those are all things that could potentially cause the caucus to debate this. But I think I am confident in saying filibuster reform is not first on the agenda in the Democratic Senate.
Okay, so if filibuster reform is not imminent, then this really turns the attention to moderates, both in the House and the Senate. Congressman Bart Stupak, during your time in the House of Representatives, you were well known as a moderate. What do you see? How do you see that group, the people that you talk to a lot on the Hill now? How do you see them looking at these opportunities and moments for impact, especially in the next 3 months, 6 months?
Oh, well, they hold all the cards. I mean, and if you're a moderate in the Senate, I think you even hold more cards than you do in the House. You need that center, and who's going to move either side to get to your 52 votes or to your 60 votes, as we talk about in the Senate. You're going to have to bring along a lot of people along. So the moderates are really in key place. And the group that is often overlooked, I think, in the House as the moderates is that new Democratic coalition. If you take a look at that group, it's always right around 100. It's one of the largest caucuses in the House. 40% of the Democratic caucus belongs to this new Democratic coalition, which is more of a pro-growth, pro-business, more of a moderate group of people. And when you take a look at those members, 80% of them, of those new Democratic coalition members, won a seat that was held by a Republican or a previous new Democrat. So it's a more moderate district. So that's a group you should be paying attention to. And those are the folks who've been there for a little bit of time, like Jim Hines up in Connecticut. And there's a group of them, Ron Kine. The Blue Dogs actually lost. The Conservative Democrats actually lost in this last election. So it's a pretty interesting dynamic. I can see the Democratic Party in the House with this big block being much more moderate than what is being reported in the news media. And it strengthens the senators that Nick mentioned one or two, whether it's Manchin, Tester, or Sinema. They have a lot more power than they did 2 days ago. And on the Republican side, Murkowski and Collins and Romney, they have much, much more power than they did 2 days ago.
Well, and I think the first place that this is going to really be seen impactfully on the Hill is going to be with COVID relief. And, yesterday, Democrat leader Schumer said that one of the first bills will be a $2,000 payment to individuals. Further, President-elect Biden has made clear that COVID relief is one of their primary focuses. Going back to December or the end of last year, a $908 billion relief package was signed into law. It provided a $600 stimulus check to those who qualify, $300 per week in additional federal unemployment benefits for about 11 weeks. That 11 weeks is important. $284 billion to the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses, $25 billion to help qualified renter households and pay rent and utilities, and $16 billion for vaccine development and distributions, as well as $82 billion for education, $10 billion for childcare, $13 billion. So a massive bill was just passed. And I think what's interesting is there's already discussion about what can happen next. And we're going to get to that in a second. But, right now you've got billions of dollars at federal agencies. And that's on the table now. And so, Congressman Stupak, what happens now with that funding? And what do our clients need to do? There was one thing to advocate Congress, but now that it's headed to the agencies, what should our clients do to position now?
Sure. And the good news is they also passed the appropriation bills, the omnibus bills. So the agencies are funded, departments are funded through September 30th of 2021. So there shouldn't be any games like holding up money to make sure that the department's doing well or the agency has the funds to meet its everyday obligations, because the Congress passed that in the omnibus. So the COVID relief bill, I would look at not just HHS, because you think that's where it'd be, CDC, NIH, but look at like ag, It's amazing how much money is there. The one that a lot of people overlook is FEMA. This is a national pandemic. FEMA received a lot of money in those pieces of legislation for COVID relief, and they have probably more discretion in working with the states on how they want that money to flow to a Michigan or a Maryland or Mississippi, whatever it might be. So, and that's one I think we miss a lot on. And I know Sarah and you and Nick, you guys have worked a lot on education field, a lot in education. So there's our job would be to make sure we plug you into the right program. Right now with COVID, we're working on a program where we're identifying how do you know who got the immunization for COVID? You have to verify that's the right person, and that person who's claiming he had it actually can prove it. So where you're looking at an immunization program, which is found in CDC, where you'd think would be in NIH. So just got to plug them in the right spots, and we've been doing a lot of that, and have in my 30 years in Washington. But Sarah on education.
As a quick follow-up, Congressman, as a former member, how receptive are these agencies when they're hearing from members of Congress about kind of how the money is being rolled out?
Well, every agency has a legislative branch to it, legislative affairs. So you start there. But what you find once you get past the legislative group, the day-to-day government employees who are there working, not the political appointees, but the day-to-day, they're very receptive. They want to help make their program successful. And the legislative affairs folks tie that bridge for you. But again, reach out to those programs, the career people. They're going to be there for a long time, and you're going to need them. So
thank you, Congressman.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mike, can you also weigh in here? You're the most recent former staff director for the Energy and Commerce Committee, with wide discretion over a tremendous amount of agencies and oversee a tremendous amount of policy. But you've got experience here not only crafting bills, but following its implementation at the agency level. How would you work with the agencies to ensure that the direction of Congress is going to be followed here?
I mean, in addition to, working directly with those agencies and engaging, I would go to the authorizing committees, depending on what the issue is. I think that there's where these COVID bills are different. Usually, maybe it's in a too idealistic of a world, but the authorizing committees come up with the idea, they develop it, they conduct hearings, they hear from stakeholders, they draft a bill, and then the appropriators fund that bill at the level they think is appropriate, with some guidance from the authorizers. And these bills, we've pushed like a beach ball through a snake. We pushed this tremendous amount of money out there to the agencies. And I think there's going to be a certain amount of the authorizers wanting to get back in the game and retroactively make sure that money's being administered equitably, that there isn't waste, that it's that the congressional vision, to the extent that you can point back on something, is being implemented. And so I think you can really do a lot of good work. I know that my counterpart on the Democratic side, Frank Pallone's staff, and my side, Greg Walden's staff, they spent a lot of time this summer on the other bills, almost being ombudsman for people to help them engage at the right level. Just as Bart was saying, they would know if it was CDC versus HHS versus FDA and or FEMA or the Surgeon General. So I would encourage, working through the agencies, of course, but then also through the authorizing committees in the House and the Senate.
Yeah, it sounds like there's going to be tremendous opportunity here, working with the committees, working with individual member offices to ensure that just because the big bill, $908 billion, was pushed through, that's not really the end of it, and making sure that it's implemented correctly. There's still a tremendous amount of part of that game. Well, so that was the bill that was passed. But let's take a second and talk about moving forward here. It seems to me that there was a lot left on the table, and especially with the dynamic flipping in the Senate. Nick, you've been working really hard to follow the Biden administration and kind of their moves since November, as well as the Senate Democrats. And with your over 15 years of working in both the Senate and the House, and understanding that they're probably not going to move stimulus through a reconciliation, although I guess they could do some things. This is going to be maybe more of a 60-vote bill what would the Biden administration like to see as a timeline for the next action, however big it may be?
Yeah. So not to rehash too much, but the $900 billion bill we were just talking about, I mean, that was signed into law around December 27th, which I think buys a little time for the new administration going into, the first few months. That money's got to get out the door. You've got to see what's working and what's not. Really, from a calendar perspective, the first thing coming is so in that bill, they did an extra 300 week for unemployment for 11 weeks and an additional 13 weeks of unemployment total eligibility. Both of those things expire March 14th. So that is a sort of, I don't want to say artificial. I mean, it's very real to the people on unemployment insurance, but it is a little bit of a deadline that Congress has to work with. Now, remember, the extra unemployment insurance, the $600 a week checks expired back in July, and it was December before they did anything about it. So I'm not saying it's definitive that will force congressional action, but I think you're going to see a lot of effort to extend those unemployment pieces. And then the question becomes, what else can or should ride along with that? And from my standpoint, a big factor there is just going to be how things are going. What do unemployment numbers look like? How is the vaccine distribution rollout going? Does it get better? Does it get worse? Does the virus get worse? Are the daily cases and deaths, even at 3,000 a day? I mean, those are still alarming numbers. So I think all of that is going to inform both the timeline and the substance.
Yeah, but but the first bite at the apple might be unemployment insurance, which will be somewhere in March, where they will probably look to do something. Although that they could do that a little bit later, as they did in the past. Sarah, you have been laser focused on the PPP program as well as education and health aspects of COVID. So you've kind of been following this day to day since March. What some of the things that were taken care of in the last bill, but more importantly, what are some things that have been left on the table that they're going to immediately turn to that could mirror up with this March kind of loose date?
I think we've talked a little bit earlier about these $2,000 checks. There's been, Schumer, you mentioned that Schumer called for those to move right away. In talking with people on the House side, I think the speaker has put a little cold water on that, because I don't think she wants to take that as a reason to move a COVID package when they need to, whether that's in March or some other time. But I do think that there's a lot of bipartisan support for additional money directly to individuals. Even on the Senate Republican side, Rubio has signaled that he's open to additional money above the $600 that was in the last bill. Certainly Senator Hawley has been very vocal about these $2,000 checks. So I think that more direct payments to individuals is certainly in the mix. I would add to that state and local. You have, obviously, that's been something that Democrats have said must be in. Governors have really been calling for it. And on the Republican side, you have members like Susan Collins and Senator Kennedy, who have also said, there's others, but they've also said that state and local money is important to them as well. So I think that's another thing that really has, it should be in the mix. And whether or not that's paired with liability, I think the dynamic has really changed there. I think that you certainly have all of the Democratic support. And then if you start peeling off members from the Republican side, it's just different. The kind of bill that you have to put together in order to have the majority support it, it's just different when you have a majority leader, Schumer, than with Republicans. And I would also add to that, you talked a little bit about school money before, and so did the congressman, but Biden himself has called for additional tens of billions of dollars for schools. That's probably needed, given that he has called for governors to open the schools within the first 100 days of his presidency. So there's going to be a need for additional funds there, probably, to reopen schools. But like Nick said, we're going to have to see what it is exactly that's needed. It's talking to educators, it's talking to the superintendents. So I would say those are some things that I've been, in talking to staff, that is definitely on the table.
But in your opinion, there is more than enough left on the table from the last round that members and senators are actively engaged on that they will be pushing for?
Yeah, I mean, we have the work of the bipartisan group, which had a meaningful impact on what was passed last time. So I think we can look to them or some process like that to come up with what has enough votes for 60. Certainly the things that Nick talked about with unemployment expiring and some of these other provisions, the eviction moratorium, things like that are going to be pressures on in terms of timing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those will, coupled with these other things like that are very popular, the direct payments, the money for schools, things like that, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to see that another package could come together, during the first quarter or perhaps, beginning the second quarter of this year.
All right, thank you. So just for everybody's edification, today's CLE code is Congress 2021. A CLE submission form will be emailed to all registrants sometime next week. So we've touched on this a lot around the edges, but I really want to drill down into this. The dynamics have changed on the Hill between 2 weeks ago, a week ago, and today. And so, Nick, the last COVID response measure was pretty difficult to come by. It was something that took a lot of push and pull at a whole bunch of different spots. Ultimately, as the time wound down on the year, leadership on both sides moved and they were able to put something together. But as I just said, a lot's changed. Can you take a minute to walk us through the new dynamic in Washington?
Sure. And I mean, some of it is a little bit of a rehash of what we talked about at the top with the new Senate dynamics and what Bart talked about with the narrow House majority. But I mean, you have Speaker Pelosi, you'll soon have Leader Schumer, and then soon have President Biden. So, Democrats can set a lot of the agenda here and at least get the ball rolling. But let's set aside the notion of using reconciliation for the purposes of COVID for a second, because I don't think that's really on the table right now. That's certainly not how Democrats would prefer to do a COVID package. You are going to have Republican buy-in in both chambers, but certainly in the Senate.
Yeah.
And, one of the things we saw with all of the previous COVID packages was the congressional committees, the authorizers and the appropriators. The chairman and the ranking members were talking amongst themselves and hashing out what they could. The big ticket items really got kicked up to leadership. The things we saw in the headlines, those were Pelosi, Mnuchin, Meadows, McConnell decisions. But a lot of the stuff in those bills was really worked out on a fairly bipartisan basis at the committee level. And I think that's while some of our leadership has changed or will change soon, the overall dynamics of how the Hill is going to put a bill together hasn't changed that much, in my opinion.
Congressman, can you touch on how the House Democrats will approach COVID with a narrower majority?
Well, again, the narrow majority, it's the smallest majority they've had ever. So they're going to have to be very thoughtful about it. And again, the moderates hold the key. They had their $2 trillion bill out there, okay? And even when they put together the COVID response bill, the bipartisan group, that $908 billion one, the House still came back with $1.5 trillion as their response to it. The Democrat House, they're going to have to put together a smaller bill, and a little bit more realistic on what is going to be acceptable, not just to the Senate, but also the new administration. And so I think that their priorities in that $2 trillion bill they had before for COVID that they passed like in August or whatever. And I'm agree with Sarah. I think you're going to see a lot of money in there for education, for schools, getting people back. I think you're going to see a greater emphasis upon distribution of the vaccine and follow-up of the vaccine. And I think you're going to see that $2,000 amount of money that they wish to give out. So it's going to be more oriented towards people, less oriented towards projects. So I think the stuff that was the projects will be dropped off it. But Pelosi's got a tough job here. I mean, it's going to be the toughest one she's ever faced, with about like a 222 at best majority, which gives you four members. And remember, you got 2-3 of them already in the administration, Democratic House members. they'll stay Democratic, but you're going to have a lag there before you're going to pick up a new election to pick up these and fill these seats. So it's going to be a tight squeeze to get legislation through that does not have support on both sides.
Yeah, Mike, so turning to the House Republicans here, they are focused 100% on taking back the majority. But unlike 2008 with President Obama and the ARA, that stimulus, when they voted in unison against that, they're on the record voting for COVID relief for the last year. How do the House Republicans play ball here in this dynamic where they're trying to take back the majority, but there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of work for their constituents in front of them? You're on mute again.
Definitely tension, because like you said, they do have their eye on the midterm election. And they also traditionally, when you're the minority party in the House and you don't control your party doesn't control the Senate or the White House, you're the least, relevant player. But these are unprecedentedly thin majorities. And so if the speaker moderates or gives directions to moderate the bill, like Bart was saying, in order to make it more attractive to the Senate, maybe you lose some folks on the far left, but then you pick up a bunch of problem solver people, that come on board. The seats that they did win this last election were women, people of color, suburban districts. Those aren't, the hardcore base of the party. They're people that are going to want to come in and, things reopening schools. That's going to be high on the list. They're going to know small businesses that are struggling. I think there will be appeal, and just like Bart was saying, the Speaker Pelosi will have a fine line to walk. Kevin McCarthy will be too, because he needs to show he's hardcore, but he also needs to show that he's not just being a rigid obstructionist. Yeah,
Sarah. Obviously the big difference between the House and the Senate: 2-year terms versus 6-year terms. What's the dynamic with Senate Republicans on this? How do you see them playing with a Biden COVID response proposal?
There's been a number of Republicans in the Senate that have already shown willingness to work with their colleagues across the aisle. That bipartisan process that I mentioned before, had the usual suspects, but I think it also had some people that maybe we weren't expecting to participate in it, and it grew as they got farther along. So those people are still going to want to try to work with the Democratic colleagues. That is going to be the same. What is also the same are the members in the Senate that are running for, president in a few years, and that's going to impact how they behave as well. So that's not really a change from last time. I think what the big change is that we, all of us keep reiterating is this power and control over the Senate schedule and the floor. And so really it empowers those bipartisan minded Republicans, because all of a sudden the things that they're working on with the Democratic colleagues are more likely to get a vote. So in that way, their work becomes a lot more meaningful just by virtue of the fact that their legislation and their work can see the light of day.
You're definitely going to see too, now you're in the minority, the posture of Senate Republicans are going to change a little bit because they don't have the gavels. And the inverse goes for the Senate Democrats. Nick, does this change the Senate Democrats' posture on some of these bills? Are they going to be more aggressive on some things and less aggressive on others? Does that change the dynamic that we've kind of seen for the last year?
Yeah, I think it does change the dynamic quite a bit for a number of reasons that we've talked about. In my experience, and I think this is true in both chambers, but particularly in the Senate, it is easier for the party to be unified when they're in the minority. It's easier to just lock arms and say no, or say this isn't enough. It's going to be a lot harder for Schumer to hold his very diverse caucus together in the majority. And sometimes that means you maybe lose a Bernie Sanders, or sometimes that means you lose a Joe Manchin on any given issue. But I think the Democratic approach in the Senate, that's part of the dynamic. The other piece of it is you look at COVID specifically. House Dems send over the massive, $3.5 trillion HEROES Act. That's immediately the Senate Democratic position. Well, now that Democrats actually have some power in the Senate and can decide what's voted on, you're going to have a lot of heartburn actually about probably a $3.5 trillion price tag among some Senate Democrats. So I think House Democrats are going to have to be a little more realistic about what they send the Senate in order to not put Senate Democrats in a tough spot of having to reject the progressive position.
Yeah, and you bring up a really interesting point, and that's kind of the dynamics about how something like this may come together. So let me put you on the spot. How would something like this happen? I mean, would this be something that Biden sends down some principles? It's ultimately written in the House. Is it written in the Senate? How do you see the Democrats kind of coming together for that initial, here's our kind of first proposal?
I think with the UI deadline, you kind of got a starting point. We're not starting from scratch here. I mean, this will be, if there is another COVID package, and with Democratic, I think either way, there would probably be another COVID package. I think with the Democratic Senate, there will definitely be another COVID package. But we're not starting from square one. This will be the 5th or 6th COVID package, depending on how you count
right.
it. So both parties, both chambers, they already know what their positions are. They have language on a lot of this stuff. The Biden administration has policy positions on a lot of this. A lot of that, they frankly took cues from House Democrats and what they were putting in their proposals. So I think they all get in a room and they hash out principles, and then the committees get to work with the language and the details.
Congressman, any thoughts there on how the House Democrats, how this may, I mean, they're going to take kind of cue from Biden, but yet they've already kind of got ideas on what they want to do because they've been doing this for a year now? Agreed.
That's why they're going to do it, but Biden's going to have a greater impact by giving them, here's my principles. Let's meld your principles. Let's get them together. I'll go back and write the specifics. And that's where all of us come in, is in trying to get the language and such. But a COVID bill, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, or I think Mike said, pushed a lot of money through, and the programs, we'll worry about that later. But now I think after a year of COVID, there'll be a little more specificity in these programs, especially for education, getting K through 12 up running again. So
yeah,
but March is a good time. I think by the end of February, they have another COVID bill done.
Yeah. So Sarah, a bill comes in, starting to be drafted. Democrats kind of coalesce around something. Where's the Republicans in the Senate going to be on this? Specifically, that gang that kind of got together at the end of the year to push action. How do you see that playing out?
I think it really depends on how Schumer and the Democratic leadership want to organize this effort. What we saw with Republicans in control of the Senate majority was they needed to figure out what they were for before they could really bring in opinions from the outside to start negotiating. So you saw a lot of work being done in the committees to draft these various pieces, but they had to make sure that they had their members on board, which is frankly what took so long and why they had to keep rewriting it. You saw they had heels, they broke it up into pieces, they couldn't push those through, they tried to do a smaller bill. I mean, really, it was difficult to try to get enough votes together on the Republican side to put something on the floor that the members were going to support. So I don't think that we'll have the same thing happen here. Democrats are not as shy about spending money on these programs, whereas, on the Republican side, we're a bit constrained by people that are more fiscal hawks. So here, I'm not quite sure. I think the bipartisan process is something that we should look to for lessons from the past on things that when you reach a log jam, you have a group come together to really try to hammer it out, and that informs the broader process. But I think we'll probably see a lot of work done on the Democratic side. And then perhaps they start negotiating with their Republican counterparts, knowing that they'll need to, peel off another 10 votes or so, 9 to 10 votes to pass something.
Yeah. It almost seems like, the pattern here with these bills is that you have the debate on whether we should do something. And then once that debate is won that you're going to do something, it kind of goes to leadership that we're going to do something. They go down to the authorizing committees. The authorizing committees figure out what they can do, bumps up to the Appropriations Committee, then back to the Leadership Committee and the administration to kind of put the whole sausage together. And it's probably going to be the same level of that. It's just different players in different spots on the chessboard kind of remove Mnuchin out of the equation and Meadows, and you obviously have the Biden administration moving in. Mike, I think for most of the people participating today, they're probably sitting here and saying, okay, I understand that the whole dynamic has changed. I understand filibuster reform's where it's at. I understand there's going to be this COVID relief package. What do I need to do now to get ahead of what could happen on March 11th or a little bit after that? Because when Congress does move on these bills, the last one was pretty big. I mean, taking apart the omnibus, it's still probably a 2,000-page bill. What should people be doing now?
Well, they should be engaging with the committees of jurisdiction, certainly. They should be looking to the past bills to find out who are the interested members and staff and try to enlist them as champions, whether it's you're trying to get a nuance changed or some more specificity, as the congressman was saying. You don't want to wait. You want to be getting into talking to people early and often, and then there are going to be other opportunities beyond March. So it's never wasted time to go in and try to think of it as education and getting people ready. A lot of new members too. Yeah. So.
Right, absolutely. Congressman, if I can bring you in here for a second, you were lobbied by your constituents. Advocates came in. You did this for 18 years. When you're digesting a request and you're trying to understand the policy being put before you and trying to judge whether that policy is something that makes sense and you're going to champion or not, what are some of the things that you're trying to think through as you're making that decision, if you don't mind opining on that for a minute?
Sure. If you're a House member, first you're going to say, okay, what's the impact on my district? But how does that program help my folks back home? But then the next one is, okay, who else on committee is on Energy and Commerce, and so who else on committee or in the Ed and Labor Committee, who's a natural ally with me? And then who in the administration is going to be able to help us out? So number one, is it good for your district? I mean, if it's not, you're not going to be a champion of it. I mean, you're just not going to.
Mm-hmm. But you could vote for it.
Yeah, you can still vote for it, but you're not going to be putting a lot of time and resources into it. And depending on the degree of the issue or project, some of your most valuable staffers you'll put to it if it's a big deal to your district. But most members, I would hope, not only is it your district, but is it good for the country? And that's what they have to keep in mind. Easy votes and easy legislation is when it's good for the country and for your district. The tough ones when it's good for the country, but not your district. So yeah, I might not champion it, but I'll certainly help the process along. So it's those relationships and who do you know on the other committee that you need to help you with it.
Yeah, Sarah and Nick, I just want to bring you in here for a second. So the congressman's had a lot of wins in the last couple of bills, but you two specifically have gotten a lot of things championed in these COVID bills. What have you been focusing on? How have you been winning in these COVID bills? And what would be some recommendations that you're seeing play out in these negotiations that have helped you make sure that the members and senators have understood the policies you're advocating for? Sarah, if you don't mind going first.
Sure. I want to just piggyback on what Congressman Stupak said, and that is getting those constituent members engaged. You need to have a champion when staff, especially in the committees, are dealing with so much. They're overwhelmed. These are big bills. They're often trying to legislate. I mean, these are such important issues. They're hearing from everyone. So you've got to break through the noise. So of course you want to talk to those committee staff, make sure they're educated, but you may or may not have them be your actual champion. They've got a lot of stuff going on. So what we've been doing is not only talking to those policymakers at the committee level, but going to the individual members in the states, whether that's House members or on the Senate side, those states, and making the case to them. Why does this impact their state? what is going on that they need to be aware of, and then having them communicate with committee staff. And it takes a long time. We have been working on some issues for clients starting immediately after CARES, letting them know the impact that CARES had on, good or bad, on the people that we were working with. And it took until December to really get something through. And up until the last minute, they were trading paper on various policies. So a lot can happen at the last minute, but like Mike said, do not wait. You need to be in there now. But it's really those constituent members that I think are the key here, because they need to understand what's happening on the ground so they can go make the case then to perhaps committee and leadership.
Right. Nick?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the piece I would add to it is finding bipartisan support for it. If you can convince the committee staff or a member that this has bipartisan buy-in, all of a sudden it's not controversial. Now it might still be, but that's at least the first step in kind of their litmus test of how big of a fight is this going to be. So that's something we've done on a number of issues on COVID, and tends to work out pretty well.
And Josh,
and ultimately, please go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to add that on this last bill, it was I know the committee that Bart and I had worked for, Energy and Commerce, they got in about 35 to 38 bills, depending on you count it, that were tangentially relevant to the big package, and it was because they were able to go to leadership and say, we got a big four agreement. The Senate R's and D's agree, and the House R and D's agree. You take this as a win, put it in, and it just made life I wanted to echo what Nick was saying. It makes life a lot easier for everybody when you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of last question here, Nick, for you. If they don't get a big bill done in March, they do just UI and some smaller things to extend. What are some deadlines that are coming up for Congress that's kind of following that March 11th that they might write on to as a must-pass deadline?
Yeah, so this Congress has a handful of them. First and foremost is, of course, the regular annual appropriations process. So the FY21 bills are done. They will get started and those run through end of September. So the appropriators, in addition to whatever they're doing with COVID, they're going to get started pretty quickly on the fiscal year 2022 bills. Kind of the other two pressure points, and not that they would necessarily be a place for COVID, but it's at least a legislative vehicle. Congress has to raise the debt limit by August 1st, and surface transportation programs expire at the end of September. There are a handful of other expiring programs at the end of September, but surface transportation is the big one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So as we're kind of coming up on the hour, we're wrapping up here. First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists, Nick, Congressman Stupak, Mike, and Sarah. Thanks for being here today to answer these questions. I think for those who've been watching for the hour now, I think you're seeing that the dynamics have changed. The most important dynamic of Tuesday was control of the Senate floor. That allows Biden to do so much more and the incoming administration than perhaps they originally were going to be able to do. It also changes who they can put in some key spots, especially if they need to come for a floor nomination. There's going to be action in the 117th Congress. The Biden administration has made it clear that COVID relief is their focus, and that doesn't mean that there's other things that they're going to do. There's plenty of things they're going to do, but this, more than anything in the middle of the pandemic, is clearly a focus. And with that UI around March 11th, we hope that today you've gained some insight into what the possible is, why there's a sense that there's going to be a new bill, the new players and where they engage, but also learn a little bit more about what the Venable team has been doing for the past year to position our clients. And more than happy to have conversations with you about where things are going and how to position, because we see a lot of moving pieces on the board, and our bipartisan, bicameral team understands so much of what's happening because we've been there as staffers or members ourselves. And so, again, I want to thank all the panelists. We will be publishing more information on a potential stimulus and the impacts of the 117th Congress and the impacts of the incoming Biden administration. So please stay tuned for that. And in conclusion, I just want to say thank you for joining us for today's discussion. A recording of the session will be available shortly on our website. The members of this panel will be responding and getting back to those that have asked questions during the presentation in the coming days. And we also invite you to visit venable.com to contact our legislative and government affairs professionals if you have any additional questions. Thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your day.